World leaders have called for an urgent ceasefire in Syria as government forces pounded the opposition-controlled eastern suburbs of the capital in a campaign that has left hundreds of people dead. Joining me with that story and everything else this morning, our Director of the Irish Academy of Public Relations, Ellen Gunning, and Francis Fitzgibbons, CEO of Strorystock. Good morning to you both. Look, Ellen, you would want to have a heart of absolute stone not to have been moved by the images of innocent people, and in particular innocent children, living in those sorts of conditions and facing constant shelling. It just beggars belief sometimes to think that there are innocent human beings living like that.
This war,
right under our nose.
This war has been going on for 7 years. 400,000 people have died. It's just hard to credit. And you look at the images and there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. And what really, really annoys me is that the UN has called for a ceasefire, which is fine. But politics is the art of the possible. So they call for a ceasefire, and Sweden and Kuwait say, we must get a ceasefire. And Russia eventually voted against it. And it seems that it's all down to semantics. Right? There are people who are losing their lives. There are people who are living underground in bunkers. There are hospitals telling you they cannot cope with the amount of people who are coming in. You can't be on the streets anywhere in eastern Ghouta for more than 15 minutes. And yet, it comes down to semantics.
400 people dead in this particular incident, I suppose. Over 2,000 who are wounded. You have spent the week listening to accounts from people who are living in those conditions, Francis, through your company Strorystock.
Yeah, so at
describing
Strorystock,
what they see, what they feel.
Yeah, we partner with a company in Malta who are engaged in trying to get people out of Syria and bring them to safer zones around the world. And this particular week, we were going through a lot of people's individual stories who had come from Syria, who had talked about losing sons, daughters, very often in front of them. And when you hear the stories of the people who had, I mean, Syria was not some economic backwater. Syria was a very developed, very functional, one of the oldest countries in the world. Damascus, one of the oldest cities in the world.
People had a normal way of life.
You're
people
talking
had
about
homes and businesses
shopkeepers,
and careers,
pharmacists, who 8 years ago might have had a very successful, lucrative career and a very nice middle-class lifestyle, who are now living, you know, at the whim of the German government or the, you know,
Russian government,
or whoever it is. So it's really, really unfortunate when you see the stories firsthand. It really brings home what's happening here. And then you have, so the Russians have basically created an amendment to take account of the shelling coming the other way. Now, and that is something we have to bear in mind as well. So the shells coming both ways.
Let's just explain this to people, because I think a lot of people at home would be thinking, OK, this is almost like a no-brainer. The UN Security Council are calling for this 30-day ceasefire. We want to evacuate those who have died, those who are injured, those who need medical assistance, and we need to bring in humanitarian aid. Why are Russia vetoing this? What is the big deal? Explain to people what the background is.
So what Russia are obviously supporting Assad and his
the Syrian government.
Yeah, with the rebels. So what Russia have proposed is an amendment to the vote which takes place today, and the amendment really, I suppose, puts the shells coming from the rebels to Damascus more in the resolution. So there are shells coming both ways.
I.e. both sides are to blame here, is what they're saying.
Yeah,
That's
and there's also accusations that the civilians are being used as human shields by the rebels. So it's not just one innocent party versus another. Now, naturally, of course, you have the civilians caught up in the centre, but is it a civil war? You have the rebels on one side in the suburbs of Damascus, and then you have the government. So the rebels are shelling the government in Damascus, and the government are shelling back with the assistance of the Russians. It's feared that the government, with the assistance of the Russians, are getting ready for a ground offensive on these suburbs to kind of cleanse them of the rebels, and that's why they're pounding the from the sky with bombs.
And that Russia is actually just stalling here. They're trying to stall time because they want to give the Syrian government the opportunity to go in here and carry out this offensive.
Yes, because if they're going to go in with ground troops, the more you can kind of disable the systems, disable the anti-tank guns, disable their troops and everything on the ground, the easier it is for the troops to just roll in there and, you know, claim back the suburbs of Damascus.
OK, so we have had, as you said at the beginning, Ellen, this has started in 2011, it's now 2018. We have had talks with the Arab League, went into one stage at the very beginning to try and kind of broker a deal between both sides. We've had talks in Geneva, in Vienna. We have the Astana talks. Nothing appears to be working here. Is there a solution, and what is the solution going to be, and who needs to get involved, or what could possibly happen so that we don't continue seeing the footage that we're seeing this morning?
It's very hard to know who could be involved. The UN seem to be the logical people. They are the United Nations.
And at one stage,
they
Russia
are a
did say
peacekeeping influence.
that it would be the UN Security Council, their resolution. It would be through them that they would find a compromise here.
And Russia are actually talking, and what bugs me is that it seems to be down to semantics now. I know that there's a war being fought on the ground, but really to try and get a ceasefire, one side is saying, Sweden and Kuwait are saying they want an immediate 30-day ceasefire, and Russia are saying they want a de-escalation. Surely somebody should be able to find a formula of words that allows it to stop, so that Russia can say it has de-escalated and Sweden can say there is a ceasefire.
Well, this was meant to be a de-escalation zone, wasn't it, in Gout, and that clearly hasn't worked.
It hasn't worked at all. They need, I think if the UN really is to maintain any relevance, it's got to find a way of making things happen. It's become over the years something of a talking shop. It's a super idea, but it's not delivering
Just ask
anything.
very quickly, Ellen, do ordinary people in the Western world care about this? I mean, that is something I think we've heard from newsrooms time and time again. I see it all over Twitter, editors in newsrooms right around the world looking at this footage and thinking, do viewers in Ireland, in England, in the States, do they actually care about this?
I think they care, but I think the level of care depends on how close you are to the conflict. And I think that's true the world over. I think if this was happening in the UK, more people would have an interest in it. I think if it was happening in Germany, fewer people would have an interest in it. And the further away from you it gets,
it's just too remote.
It's too remote. You don't identify with people as much. And that's what makes it more difficult, I think, for people to come forward and argue the case more strongly.
Okay. Just very quickly.
When you see, like, the social media in particular, when you see kids in the back of ambulances, like that very famous child in Syria who went viral, that's when they care. You know, when you see kids involved, and because you empathise, you're sitting at home, you have kids of your own. Otherwise, it's just a conflict on the other side of the world that really doesn't resonate with you much.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there, folks, but thank you both for joining us this morning.